Guns, tanks, planes, bombs, and nukes. Don't worry, you clicked on the right episode. Here in episode 5 of Historic Autographs World War II series, I'm RJ, and I'll be rambling at length about the arms and armaments that were used most prominently and notably in World War II. Guns, tanks, planes, and bombs were just some of the technological devices being used by every major power, and each of those are their own expansive categories with a long list of inventors and advancements. Before we get into it, though, I'll cover some expectations. This video will be 3 chapters: firearms, tanks, and aircraft. Sorry, no time for boats. We talked about nuclear weapons last episode, so I won't cover them again here. We can only realistically cover a small handful of models for each chapter in the time we have. Lastly, like in other videos in the series, I want to take a moment to address the seriousness of these topics. I, like at least some other people, I don't want to make any sweeping claims, find sharp things and explosions pretty cool. I also find history to be cool, and so the history of sharp things and explosions, it's like 3 different cools in one. But as fascinating as all this stuff is, the intended purpose of a weapon of war is to end human lives. That's not cool to me. I don't like people dying, and war freaking sucks. I readily acknowledge that seriousness, but that said, this video will be about the technology and not the lethality. If that works for you, let's get started. Firearms, the quintessential tool of modern warfare. Being able to punch things incredibly hard and with great precision from a distance has been a fixture of human conflict since gravel. Firearms in the modern age, whether we're talking about 2025 or 1925, are going to be comparable because the foundational tech is the same for every firearm. The rest is just iterations to adjust a few parameters. You're going to have a projectile or projectiles surrounded by a casing containing propellant. The firearm, or gun, is comprised of the bit you hold, a mechanism to carry one or multiple cased projectiles, a hammer to activate the propellant, and a barrel to direct the projectile. World War II firearms were generally made of wood and metal, since the plastics and polymers that make up everything today weren't a thing yet. The mechanical pieces of guns would be metal, and the ergonomic pieces, grips and stocks and such, would be wood. Categories of World War II firearms are labeled based on their intended function. Pistols, also known as handguns or sidearms, are guns which are small, low weight, low capacity, and generally low impact. That is to say, they tend to use physically smaller and less powerful ammunition. They can be easily carried at the hip or under an arm. Rifles are high impact and long range. Rifles were the standard for infantry. Machine guns are high-impact, long-range, and high-capacity with a high rate of fire. They're scary and powerful, but all that ammo and metal makes them very bulky, which is why they invented submachine guns, which are effectively bigger pistols with higher capacity and fire rate. There are more categories and subcategories, but those terms will serve us fine for our uses here. And while I won't go into detail on them, there was common use of mortars and grenades, mortars being portable tubes using propellant to lob explosives, and grenades being hand-thrown explosives. First, we'll talk about pistols. Like I said, a running theme here will be that there were dozens of kinds of pistols from different manufacturers. Each major power had 1 or 2 standard sidearms, if not more, which were produced by 1 or 2 weapons manufacturers, if not more. Smaller nations that didn't have their own military-industrial complexes might have acquired their sidearms from those larger powers, or they just imported them because they were reliable and plentiful and standard. Even with that being the case, there's no easy line to draw. There's no Allied sidearm or Axis sidearm either, because both sides would capture and repurpose weapons from the enemy, so everyone was sharing. Without crunching numbers, because to be fully honest, number crunching isn't my specialty, I compiled a list of 8 widely used sidearms, and Quick note before I give you the names, a lot of guns were named after the manufacturer, like cars. Anyway, there are the Colt Model 1911, Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, Luger pistol, Enfield No. 2 revolver, Webley Mark IV revolver, M1917 revolver, Mauser C96, and the Nambu pistol. If you recognize the model numbers in that list, you might recognize that most of those are American companies. I'm unsure if that's just reporting bias on American arms or if we just made a frick ton of guns. Either seems plausible to me. The non-American names on that list are mostly going to be either British or German, but again, for the sake of time, let's talk about the Colt 1911 and Luger specifically, both being iconic pistols used by their respective sides. In the interwar period, America was looking for a new standard military pistol that was up-to-date and reliable. Up to this point, the standard was revolvers, like the Smith & Wesson Model 10, because the rotating barrel action could be built into the trigger pull, meaning you didn't have to cock a hammer or otherwise manually load a round between shots. However, revolvers did have downsides, especially for military use, like being slow to reload. Semi-automatic rifles were a relatively new technology that used the energy of firing a round to load the next round into the chamber. Many companies around the world had semi-auto pistols that were being tested by the American military, and the winner was the manufacturer Colt with their .45 caliber semi-auto pistol designed by John Browning. Their automatic pistol was adopted as the standard in 1911 and was dubbed accordingly. The Luger has a few other names, more specifically. The Luger pistol, the Luger P08, and Pistol Parabellum. It was designed by Georg Luger, an Austrian, and adopted by several nations as the standard, typically Axis-aligned. It was produced primarily by DWM, a German firearms manufacturer. I'll admit my bias here because it was actually designed and adopted before the Colt 1911, as early as 1900, and here I am talking about it second because I had defaulted to America being the first. The Luger was actually considered by America for adoption as the standard pistol. It was tested alongside the Colt. But the Colt scored higher reliability, especially since the Lugers the US tested were adjusted to fit the parameters set by the military, and the adjustments were finicky. DWM pulled out of the competition instead of continuing to iterate on a .45 caliber Luger. Next, let's move on to rifles. The most common names that I detected were the M1 Garand, or Garand, the M1 Carbine, Enfield 1917, Lee Enfield with various makes and numbers, Arisaka, and Carabiner. For further discussion, I've chosen the Garand because it's so iconic to World War II, but the second rifle was a harder choice. I would cover the Lee Enfield, but there are several models to then have to choose from, so I decided to continue the trend of one Allied gun and one Axis gun by covering the standard German rifle, the Carabiner 98K. The name of the Carabiner 98K, or Carabiner 98 Kurz, effectively just means short carbine. Carbine is another general firearm term referring to a lighter and shorter rifle. It was a reliable and effective bolt-action rifle designed and built by German arms manufacturer Mauser, the design of which was an improvement upon earlier models of German rifles. Being a bolt-action rifle, it was not semi-automatic, and even a perfect bolt-action rifle would have trouble standing against the semi-automatic rifles like the famous M1 Garand. Side note, Germany did have semi-automatic and fully automatic weaponry, but their standard issue rifle was bolt-action, unlike the US. The M1 Garand was a semi-automatic rifle that was standard issue for America during World War II. It was designed by the Canadian-American John C. Garand, name pronunciation is a little weird, and adopted by the US military, with mass production of the weapon starting in 1940. Being semi-automatic, as well as reliable and plentiful, American forces had an advantage when fighting infantry against infantry, which compounded with all the other advantages America had when they entered the European theater. The M1 Garand wouldn't stop being the American standard-issue rifle until the adoption of the M14 in 1957. There's a reason this thing is iconic. Moving on to machine guns. Machine guns were the centerpiece of World War I. While the tech advanced for World War II, it wasn't uncommon to find World War I or World War I adjacent machine guns being used, the Maxim gun and Vickers gun being primary examples. World War II saw the use of a handful of models of Browning machine guns, the British Bren machine gun and Lewis gun, and the German MG42, just to name a few. Some were mounted and some were light enough to carry and fire solo, leading to a distinction between light machine guns and heavy machine guns, though specification isn't always used or needed, seemingly, from what I can find. Let's move on. It's hard to pick which to talk about because they weren't as iconic or as memorable as rifles or handguns. They're more mechanically complex, more expensive, more situational. You get the idea. Nowadays, machine guns are, to my admittedly limited knowledge, most commonly mounted, since most rifles are automatic anyway. But I do have an answer. From my perspective and lived experience, the most iconic machine guns are from World War I, but overall, there's a very good argument that I should discuss the MG34. The MG34 is a package deal with the MG42, a later model of the same machine gun. And yeah, the MG stands for Maschinengewehr, meaning machine gun. Quick side note, I didn't realize before researching this episode just how unimaginative the names for 99% of firearms are, but I digress. The MG34 was designed by Heinrich Vollmer, who worked for Mauser in 1934 when the German Defense Ministry ordered the creation of a new universal machine gun. That is, a machine gun that fulfilled all machine gun use cases: mounted guns on vehicles, mounted sentries in trenches, and light guns carried by soldiers. Before this, Germany had several single-purpose models for each application. The MG34 was an advanced and precise instrument that fulfilled all the needed qualifications. It used the MG30, an earlier model, as a base, and was widely recognized for its high performance and, as mentioned earlier, universality. It was adopted and in mass production by 1939, and it would be widely used by the German army for the entirety of World War II. That's not to say, however, that there were no drawbacks or competition. The MG34 had two major downsides. It was complex and thus expensive to mass produce, and it tended to underperform when introduced to dirt and mud, which was a common occurrence, as you might imagine. In 1942, Germany began rolling out the MG42 in response, a more reliable and easy-to-produce variant of the MG34. It did sacrifice some features, though, including that universality. It couldn't be mounted on vehicles like the 34. Both the 34 and 42 were used until the war ended. Lastly, for the firearms, we have SMGs, submachine guns. These light automatic weapons were popular with militaries because other automatic weapons up to this point were very unwieldy. The ability to equip a soldier with a gun that had 5 times the capacity and 5 times the fire rate of a semi-automatic rifle was highly sought after. That's like 5 soldiers per soldier, and was definitely worth sacrificing stopping power for weight and portability. And I figure there's only one SMG we've got to talk about, because, I mean, come on, it's the Tommy gun. What else am I going to talk about? Other widely used SMGs include the British Sten and German MP40, neither of which are still remembered today like the Tommy gun. The Thompson submachine gun was one of the earliest SMGs to be designed and widely distributed, the German MP18 being the first. The idea for the Tommy gun was actually conceived in World War I for trench warfare, since it's helpful to be able to run around trenches with something shorter than a rifle. However, the design wasn't finished in time for World War I. It went into production in 1921 and was put on the civilian market and sold in hardware stores, which is how it became the go-to weapon of choice for crime syndicates during Prohibition. But it's selling it a little short to just call it the mobster gun. I mean, the police were using it too. It was portable, powerful, and flashy. Speaking of flashy, part of its iconic appearance is the drum magazine, which, while good for capacity, was actually pretty unreliable, and military use favored the straight stick magazine. But that drum magazine was used, and was also featured in films depicting mobsters, which contributed to the Tommy gun becoming so iconic. In 1938, the Thompson was adopted by the US military and produced for the Army, whereupon it was used in World War II. The thing is, for all the hoopla, it wasn't an ideal military weapon. It was expensive, the ammunition was specialized and expensive, it had worse range than rifles, weaker overall bullet force, it could jam, it could overheat, but that didn't stop people from using it. From what I can tell, Thompsons were treasured and their owners were envied. I think it's kind of like the muscle car of military weapons, at least at the time. But that's all for firearms. Let's talk tanks. Tanks were another technology invented in World War I but massively improved for World War II. World War I tanks were slow and broke down often, but in World War II, the advancements in automotive technology from the Roaring '20s could be applied to tanks, allowing them to move faster with more reliability. Granted, it still wasn't 100%, but all things in relativity. And it certainly helped that everyone had time to iterate on the designs and add mounted cannons and whatnot. While World War I tanks were a hasty patchwork solution to breaking the stalemate, World War II tanks, especially by the end of the war, had much more solidified design parameters. That is to say, we'll talk specifics just to cover the bases, any tank from between World War II and today is going to look similar because we collectively found the most effective use case. Tanks are heavily armored vehicles designed to cross battlefields, hold defensive positions, and push into enemy territory. Typically, they feature a body that travels with the use of 2 treads instead of 4 wheels. Treads, or tracks, are like long tires made of chained plates, which allow the tank to have continuous contact with as much ground as possible to allow the tank to cross over all kinds of rough terrain. The body contains the driver, or drivers, and on top of that body is usually a turret, which can sometimes freely rotate. A lot of tanks have a big main gun or cannon operated by a gunner, but some just have mounted machine guns, or some have both. The entire tank would have thick plating, thick enough that regular gunfire would have a hard time stopping it, which led to the adoption of anti-tank weaponry like rocket-propelled grenades and landmines. Different countries tended to develop their own tank tech and classifications of tanks, so it's hard to find a simple way to categorize them without leaving some things out. But I'm gonna do that because we don't have all day. Tanks can fulfill a variety of roles in and out of combat. They can move people and resources, they can traverse difficult terrain, they can house communication technology. Their ability to pave the way for an army made them good utility as well as offense and defense. So you can see why we made so many of them. But regardless of their specific application, I'm going to keep things real simple. It's most important to know if they're fast and light, heavy and slow, or balanced in the middle. For allies, we can talk about French, British, Russian, and US tanks. French tanks were not a huge factor, sorry France, because they got taken over very early, so their factories weren't producing French tanks. As a result, France's tanks were older, slower models that were beaten out by Germany's blitzkrieg. Britain, however, had more time to work with the US to develop more tanks for the entire course of the war. British tanks were either heavy and slow infantry tanks, designed to move with infantry at walking speed, or light and fast cavalry tanks, designed for swift combat maneuvers. The most popular British tank would be a cavalry tank known as the A-13 Cruiser, which was faster and more maneuverable thanks to a new kind of automotive suspension developed by J. Walter Christie in the United States, a kind of suspension that every modern tank adopted as fast as possible. Later variations of the A-13 include the A-15 Crusader and the A-27 Cromwell, but as the war continued, America's tank production picked up pace and started filling the ranks of British tank units. Regardless, Britain possibly had the most variation in specialist support tanks that were equipped for tasks such as communication and bridge building in addition to standard combat units. America had almost no tanks nor tank production until World War II necessitated it. When that happened, manufacturers were off to the races. It carried the downside that, early in the war, the US didn't have much supply for helping the Allies. Early models of tanks like the M3 were relatively poor performers attempting to fill the role of medium tank, that is, a tank with a balance of armor weight and mobility. Also, the United States named their tanks like their firearms, M for model followed by a number. The British Army nicknamed them after American generals for easy reference, and I'll be using those names because they're cooler. The light tank version of the M3 was called the Stuart, and the medium, Grant. The Stuart and Grant tanks were widespread despite their flaws because they were reliable enough, and because having a few hundred imperfect tanks was certainly better than nothing. But fortunately, the US was able to develop a new gold standard in the M4 medium tank, also known as the Sherman. The Sherman tank was the go-to tank for Allies by the end of the war. It was an improvement on the M3 in just about every way. Better weapon stability and targeting, easier to produce and maintain, cheaper, more durable, the list goes on. There's a reason that, out of all the Allied tanks I've listed, the Sherman has the most name recognition. Russia was in an interesting spot when it came to tanks. Russia had a huge population and military and the resources to produce many, many tanks, which they took advantage of after World War I, allowing them to have relatively advanced tank production going into World War II. Their tanks were light, mobile, and plentiful, though less armored than other tanks. The most standout model at the start of World War II was the T-26. But it wasn't the most advanced. It struggled with reliability and was weak against other tanks. So by 1941, they started rolling out the T-34. The T-34 was a medium tank that was one of the most powerful and influential, forcing the Axis, followed by the Allies, to up their own game. It was far from perfect, with several design weaknesses, but it was cheap and fast to produce. Russia had a knack for streamlining their industrial processes, and it rivaled other tanks. By the end of World War II, Russia's tank design wouldn't be what gave them trouble. It was actually just poor military structure and leadership that wasn't able to work with their tank forces effectively. Despite that, Russia was the second-place tank manufacturer for the war behind the US. Moving over to the Axis, I'm going to pair Italy and Japan together, as neither were major tank producers. Italy's industry was not as robust as Germany's. They specialized in light tanks and didn't really shake up the playing field at all, and their tanks weren't ahead of the curve in engine tech or firepower or anything. Japan, meanwhile, had less use for tanks than the rest of the Axis. They didn't fight on land as much. The tanks they did produce were usually either sent to fight in China or held to defend the mainland, which never saw invasion. Then, at the tail end of the war, they went from fighting China's relatively small tank force to Russia, which was a bit of a jump that they weren't quite ready for. A lot of Japan's tanks overall were outdated models with a focus on tanks that could be used specifically to take down other tanks. Last, but far from least, Germany. Germany's tank production was the best of the Axis by far, and they were adept enough at innovating and manufacturing to go toe-to-toe with the Allies for a good few months before getting overrun. Yeah, to be frank, if you're like me, you might have gone into this with the idea that German tanks were somehow insanely powerful, and a lot of that sentiment is just from leftover propaganda, but there are details worth discussing. Germany's best tanks were the numerous model of Panzers. Panzers 1 through 5. Panzer models 1 and 2 were part of the initial blitzkrieg against Poland and France, both light tanks, and when the war started proper, the Panzer III medium tank was ready to join the fight. Germany did respond quickly and effectively to the fact that Russia's T-34s were better than their Panzer III or IV, which is why the Panzer V, or Panther, yeah, that confused me too, was developed. The Panther was one of the last big advancements before Germany fell, and while powerful, it was still weak against more maneuverable tanks in close range, a trait shared by Germany's other big tank, the Tiger. Tiger tanks were some of the biggest in the war, and unlike other models I've mentioned, it was specifically a heavy tank. From what I can tell, it was the strongest tank in World War II, with the best armor and the best firepower, but it just didn't have the speed or longevity required to get the most effective use out of it. So, while a force to be reckoned with, it didn't have any significant impact on the course of the war. Aircraft matchups in World War II were even more one-sided than tanks in favor of the Allies. The Axis gave it their best shot, but were ultimately behind the curve for much of the war. Due to just how incredibly specialized the technology is, the most notable aircraft and aviation tech will probably be British, American, German, or Japanese. Planes were used to gather intelligence on enemy industrial sites and fortifications, bomb enemy industrial sites and fortifications, or defend friendly planes while they bomb enemy industrial. You get the idea. World War II aircraft were, as such, either bombers, if their targets were on the ground, or fighters, if they were other planes. Most were propeller planes, as jet engines were a new technology showing up very late in the war, and unlike World War I, most World War II planes were fully enclosed with a single set of wings, as the maneuverability offered by biplanes was no longer an adequate trade for their lack of speed and range. Other than bombs, planes would be fitted with anywhere from 1 to 8 high-caliber machine guns installed near the cockpit, wings, or in manned turrets to fight other aircraft. Aiming a gun on a plane is really hard, so anything less than a machine gun would be kinda useless. Germany's notable aircraft can be narrowed down to two, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Junkers Ju-88. The former was a versatile fighter designed by Willy Messerschmitt and Robert Lusser. It was one of the foremost aircraft built and used by Germany. The Junkers Ju-88, meanwhile, was equally versatile, if not more so, despite being a twin-engine aircraft. It was designed to evade interception by just being faster, and it turns out that being fast made it good for bombing, fighting, recon, etc. It ended up being one of Germany's most reliable airplanes. Japan saw a lot of aviary conflict in the Pacific, meaning there were a lot of fighters for me to choose from, but there is one that is just considered the best, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. This was one of the most widely used Japanese fighters in World War II, and while they started running out of them by the end of the war, the fact remains that it could stand strong against the famous Allied planes I'm about to talk about. Of the Allies, America and Britain contributed greatly to maintaining air superiority. Britain's most famous plane was, by a mile, the Supermarine Spitfire. It was an interceptor, that is, fit for defending against attacking aircraft, designed by R.J. Mitchell, and was used before, during, and after the war. Continuously upgraded, universally applicable, and beloved by many, the Spitfire earned its place in history by just being an awesome plane. And of course, while we're here, I'll mention that the British also had very good application of radar technology to detect incoming airstrikes and defend against them accordingly. America also contributed a wide array of aircraft, many of which are recognizable today, but despite that, it's not too difficult to narrow it down to the P-51 Mustang and the B-17 Bomber. The P-51 was a fighter designed by North American Aviation, the team headed by James H. Kindleberger. While the Spitfire became the standout British plane, the Mustang became the standout American plane. Since America favored daytime bombing runs with escorted bombers, the P-51's long range contributed to its use. Speaking of bombing, the Boeing B-17 bomber was the bomber of World War II, an iconic symbol of American firepower and widely seen in the films, photos, and propaganda we use to remember the era. The B-17 had exceptional range and firepower thanks to the decision to reduce bomb capacity in exchange for more guns. All things considered, it wasn't even necessarily the best bomber out there, at least when it came to competing designs for military contracts. But it had the reputation of being robust, and it performed well enough to use in the war, and it sure is pretty to look at. And just one last thing before I close out the video. The plane used to drop the two nuclear weapons wasn't a B-17. It was the next model up, a B-29 Super Fortress. The specific plane was named the Enola Gay. The Super Fortress was a line of colossal bombercraft that were state-of-the-art at the time, but also incredibly expensive and prone to engine failure, so there weren't a ton of them in use. Planes would only get more advanced from there, though, with the invention of computers, jet propulsion, pressurized cabins, etc. The sky's the limit. See what I did there? Anyway, that's all the time we have for now. This episode was pretty long, huh? If you stuck around, thanks for watching. This was episode 5 of this World War II series brought to you by Historic Autographs. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more, and check out our website in the description for our products. Our upcoming World War II product will feature art cards, autographs, stickers, and more. See ya!